Okay, welcome everyone to this first NeuroEpigenetics Interdisciplinary lecture. And I'm extremely happy to be able to introduce to you Eva Jablonka, who will be talking about cultural epigenetics. But before we start, I would like to tell you a tiny little bit about this NeuroEpigenetics project. So I am Christine Hens. I'm the PI of NeuroEpigenetics, which was generously funded by the European Commission through an ERC starting grant. And what do we actually do in NeuroEpigenetics? A lot of things, as you see here. But basically what it boils down to is thinking about how dynamic concepts of biology influence how we think about responsibility in the context of neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism, ADHD, and Tourette syndrome. We do this in an interdisciplinary way. We currently have 3 PhD students, 3 postdocs, and 3 senior team members with backgrounds in literature studies, psychiatry, medicine, and philosophy. Some of them you will get to meet later during the response to the lecture. We also try to combine various methodologies, experimental philosophy, arts-based methods of qualitative research, and theoretical reflection. Anyway, some history to the lecture of today. When I was a PhD student some 12 years ago, I made my PhD in a traditional bioethics tradition on the use of DNA from children for genetic research. And during that period, I also read Evolution in 4 Dimensions by Jablonka and Marion Lamb, which really was an eye-opener. For me, thinking about how we think in bioethics about genes became my dream project. Now here we are, and I'm very happy and honored to introduce to you Eva Jablonka. I'm sure she needs no introduction. Eva Jablonka is a geneticist and a professor at the Tel Aviv University, and she has co-authored numerous books such as Evolution in 4 Dimensions, Animal Traditions, Epigenetic Inheritance, and Evolution. Her latest book, together with Simona Ginsberg, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, is about how our consciousness came to be and is again a very interesting read. And today she will talk to you about cultural epigenetics. Before we start, here is the agenda. So this is my welcome. Then Eva will talk for like 40-45 minutes. We have a response by Sander van de Cruys and Jo Bervoets, and then by Emma Moormann. And then there is the opportunity for you to ask some questions. Now we are using Microsoft Teams because our university tells us to do that, but we have not. But this has as a drawback that for guests the chat function is disabled. So if you want to ask something, please raise your hand. There's a hand raise button, and then we can answer your question. But please shut up your microphone and video during the talk. And I also have to tell you that this talk will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. If you are uncomfortable in asking questions orally, directly, you can always, and you would prefer to use a chat function, which is not available, you can always write me an email during the Q&A, and I'll moderate that and relay the question to Eva during the Q&A. And one last thing before we start, this is our first online interdisciplinary lecture, which we have, which we thought was a good thing to do because of the current situation with Corona. We cannot organize live events anymore, but there will be also other lectures, and the next one will be on the 28th of September, which will, the topic will be philosophical perspectives on neurodiversity, and is co-organized with LAVA and with Autism Ethics Network, and has 3 speakers, Jana van Grunsven, Robert Chapman, and Jo Bervoets. If you want to enroll, or if you want to read more about this, please go to our website. And now I'm going to stop presenting and leave the floor to Eva.
Well, thank you very much. You will not see me anymore. Maybe you will see me, but I will not see you. So I'm going to talk to a screen. I just want to apologize for the hairdo, the kind of thing that you saw on this is Corona. Yes, this is the result of Corona. I haven't seen a hairdresser for 6 next month. So it's a bit, anyway. So I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk about the lectures called Cultural Epigenetics, but it's really an attempt to see how we can incorporate what we know about epigenetics, what we think about epigenetics, into cultural studies, into studies of culture. So here it is. And now I will do a big one. Right, so I will explain the picture in due course, and I apologize for it being not having any men in it. It's not because men are not important in epigenetic inheritance. Actually, they are very important as women, but because this is how my friend Anna drew it. She said there is enough complication anyway. So what I will do is I'll give you some definitions so that we should have some common ground. I will describe some approaches to cultural evolution. I will go through it very, very quickly because I know that you know all about it.
Eva, I am
yes.
Sorry to disturb you, but have you already projected your presentation?
Yes. Oh, you don't see anything? Okay.
I don't see it, but maybe someone else sees it. Yeah.
No, probably nobody sees it. Okay, so let's do it. So let's do it. Do you see it now? No, it's not this one, sorry. Don't say, right, sorry. I will do it. Where is it? This one. Yeah. Do you see it now? Do you see it now?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, good. So here it is again. So as I said, sorry. This is the picture, and this is a picture that my friend Anna did to show the different aspects of inheritance, so, genetic, epigenetic inheritance as well, and epigenetic inheritance in the very broad sense, physiological sense, as well as cultural inheritance and behavioral inheritance. As I said, I apologize for there being no. She apologizes for there being no males there, but it's because she said it's complicated enough as it is. I can't put them in, but they're very important. So that's it. And so the way that I'm going to go about it is I'm going to give you some definitions so that we have common ground. I'm going to very, very briefly say something about different approaches to cultural evolution, especially in humans. I will then focus on our own approach. When I say our, I mean me and my colleagues, because I didn't develop these things on my own. So a developmental system approach, which is inspired by Waddington. And then I will describe what I think, what we can consider as the social landscape rather than the epigenetic landscape. I'm taking Waddington metaphors a little further. I'm going to give you 3 examples, and then I'm going to leave us to present some questions so that we can try to talk about this kind of things. Right, so what do I mean by culture? By culture, I mean, when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about a dynamic system or network of socially acquired and reconstructed patterns of behaviors, ideas, preferences, products of activity, all of which characterize a community. Evolution is a change in the frequency and nature of heritable types over time. The types can be phenotypes, and so on. Cultural types is what we're interested in. Things, behavior, culturally, things that are typical of cultural phenotypes at different levels. And human cultural evolution is the historical process of change in human cultural patterns over time. The definition, the very general common ground that I would like us to share. Now, when we're thinking, a lot of people have been thinking about cultural evolution, and they have been inspired by ideas from biology. And first, and there are different approaches. One approach is the approach that is has been developed by the American Californian school, Cosmides and Tooby, for example. The assumption is that there is massive modularity in the brain. There are pre-existing predispositions, that many different predispositions, genetic predispositions that explain the most important aspect of human culture. And when we have this kind of point of view, this different aspects of the human mind are to some extent autonomous from each other. They each develop in a different context, and they impose very strong constraints on development. How strong? Well, here we have all kinds of people have different ideas, but this is the basic idea of this. And the kind of metaphor that they are using is the Swiss knife, yes, that we see in the picture. Then we have a view which says, well, let's forget about genetics and let's forget about innate predispositions. Let's think about the cultural evolution in terms of means which are analogous in some ways to genes. They are not totally analogous, but they are basically units of information that are transmitted from one generation to the next. And the metaphor used here is kind of viruses of the mind. There is a meme which is like a virus, and it is passed from between minds, and it is also passed between generations, and it can be selected. Then we have dual inheritance models, genetic social learning-based cultural transmission, and Boyd and Richardson are representative of this approach. So we have cultural evolution, which is to some extent analogous to genetic evolution, but there are many differences as well. But the genetic evolution and cultural evolution interact. So, for example, we can have a cultural evolution based on some kind of changes introduced by people, invented by people, for example, domestication of cattle. As a result of using cattle, of herding cattle, there is benefit to people who can drink milk. Therefore, there will be, for example, there will be selection for breaking down the sugar lactose. So this is one example of the kind of coevolution that people talk about. Then there is a very closely related approach, which puts more emphasis on aspects of reconstruction of culture through niche construction. So it puts a lot of emphasis on ecological legacies. And and there is also so this is a kind of approach that is very strongly related to the dual inheritance kind of approach. But Leyland, for example, promotes it, and it really highlights the ecological aspect, the ecological legacies. There is also a view of culture that says, culture, everything that we see about culture, even the things that we think have a genetic basis, do not really have a genetic basis. They are the products of cultural evolution. And Cecilia Hayes put forward this view. She says that even the language capacity is not really the product of genetic evolution for language. It may be the product of genetic evolution for general intelligence, but not for language per se. And she says, like literacy, like, for example, our ability to read and write, which is, as we know, the product of cultural evolution, language too, like literacy, is the product of cultural evolution, and so is imitation, and so is theory of mind, and so is our moral sense. So there are lots of things that we assume have some kind of innate basis, but she claims they do not. I will not go into it, although it's an interesting approach, and it was very interesting to see what kind of predictions it has if we compare it to others. Now, what I'm going to focus on is my own approach, which shares something with all the approaches I have been talking about. And it is a developmental Waddingtonian approach. When I'm saying my approach, it's not just mine, as I said, it's mine and my colleagues. And according to this approach, a cultural system is a dynamic entity into which individuals are introduced, in which they develop, and to which they contribute. And the way that you have to think about the way that cultures are maintaining themselves over time and changing also over time is to think about the way that individuals and group of individuals become socialized into the society, into culture. And this is a system network approach. And according to this approach, what is reconstructed with modification through during cultural evolution is all kinds of inputs that are important for this kind of reconstruction. And I will go and I will develop this theme and explain what I mean very soon. So the basic idea, the basic approach is influenced by Waddington's epigenetic landscape. And I assume that you all know it. Am I right? Well, I don't hear you, so I guess you are. You do know it, but basically what we're seeing here is the pegs, the little black things are genes. The network is the epigenetic network, what Waddington called epigenetics, and what we see at the top is the phenotype, the developmental phenotype, the way that the developmental trajectory. And what this can teach us is that if we're looking at this network, we can intuitively understand that we can change many things in the genes or in the strings that in the epigenotype, in the strings that go out of the genes. And nevertheless, the landscape, the epigenetic landscape, the valleys, the various valleys that we see and hills and valleys that we see will not change. And we can also easily imagine that there can be some changes, maybe some drastic change in the network, which is a change in a hub to which a lot of strings are connected that can suddenly change the landscape very, very drastically. Or that the landscape will change as a result of many different changes in many different strings and genes. This explains two major concepts that are central to Waddington's thinking and are central to my thinking. One is plasticity and the other is canalization. I just want you to understand what Waddington meant by epigenetics, because the term epigenetics has changed during since the last third of the 20th century, and it is very different now from the original term that Waddington used. Nevertheless, epigenetics for Waddington is the branch of biology which studies the causal interactions between genes and their products, which bring the phenotype into being. Basically, it's this network you saw. This is the epigenotype, and epigenetics studies this network, studies its properties. And especially it studies two aspects. Plasticity, it is the ability of the same genotype. We don't change the genes, we don't change this little pegs that we see at the bottom picture. But because we can change whether or not these genes and how and when and where these genes are expressed, we can generate many multiple forms of morphology, physiology, and behavior in response to different environmental circumstances. Now, note that Waddington did not put into his picture the environment, but it exists very much in his writing about the picture. The second very important aspect, which is a kind of the other side of the coin of plasticity, is canalization, which is the adjustment of developmental pathways so as to bring about a uniform developmental result in spite of genetic and environmental variations. So we know very, very well that we can have a pure line, right? Individuals that are genetically exactly the same, more or less as much as anything can be the same in this world. And nevertheless, they are different in terms of their phenotype. Why? Because they were exposed to different, they are exposed to different environments. On the other hand, we know that we can have very different genotypes, and nevertheless, we can have the same phenotype. So, for example, one of the things that Waddington said, and this is canalization, he said, look, in spite of the fact that I'm looking at Drosophila melanogaster, I'm looking at fruit flies, and what I'm seeing is that they're very, very similar, in spite of the fact that there is quite a lot of genetic polymorphism there. And why? Because the networks, the structure of the networks is such that it eventually leads to the same canalized phenotype, to the same pattern of valleys and hills. And the same is true not only with respect to also with respect to the environment. You can put animals with the same or different genotype into different environments, and nevertheless they will not usually develop in the same way. Of course, not always, because we do have plasticity, but very often they will. And sometimes in order to see the difference between individuals, you really have to make a big change in the environment, because most of the little changes will be compensated by the dynamics of the epigenotype, of the epigenetic network. So this is the basic way in which Waddington thought. He never thought about this, very, very rarely did he think about a single gene. Even if he thought about a gene with very large regulatory effects, it was because this gene was changing the whole network. And usually when he was thinking about evolution, he was thinking about the way that this network changes. And very often it changes because there are many, many changes in many, many genes during evolution. And this many, many changes eventually lead to a different phenotype, different epigenotype, and which is in turn canalized. Sorry? Okay, so this is a developmental system approach, basically. And because I am a geneticist, and I'm starting from the dynamics of stability rather than the dynamics of change, as did Waddington. When you want to understand plasticity, you first want to understand stability. And then you can understand how stability, how you can have variations which lead to a difference. So for example, when you're thinking about genetics, genetics is science of heredity, but you have to understand the basic principles of genetics in order to understand how variations are introduced. In order to understand mutations, you have to understand heredity. And when you understand heredity, you can also understand hereditary variation. So the starting point is the dynamics of stability. Stability is not something that is written in stone. It requires a lot of dynamics to keep things stable. Okay. Now, so we're starting with the dynamics of stability, and we want to understand what can make a system stable. So, for example, and this is what I'm going to focus on, although this is not the only thing that is important, there can be very strong contingent system constraints and self-sustaining regulatory interactions, for example, rules of conformity, that lead to the reconstruction of a particular pattern of culture and of behavior. And what we highlight here is the role of regulatory changes in the network, the property of the network, the general properties of the network, not the property of the individual aspect. How are things regulated? What is the level of modular? How are different aspects separated from each other? Do we have to think about multi-level selection? What is the role of individuals in this? What is the role? How do we have to think about agency? For example, the agency that is involved in niche construction. The other thing that we have to think about is the high-level cultural transmission. Maybe we have mechanisms of high-level transmission that will exist even if there are very, very big changes in the network, in cultural conditions. For example, learning by rote and transmitting things with great faithfulness by rote in some cases, we see that there is a very, very high level of transmission of certain practices. For example, the samurai sword, the practices underlying the samurai sword were transmitted with extreme fidelity for 1,500 years. And then we can have also something that the people who are interested in massive modularity highlight, and these are universal cognitive attractors. So that they say, for example, Sperber will tell us that in spite of the fact that there are many, many different environments, we tend to think in a way that will end up having a particular type of effect, cultural effect. For example, our perceptual system is such that we will expect, and this is indeed what we see, that in societies with very few terms for color, there will be terms for with only 2 terms for color. The terms will be white and black, and when there are 3 terms, it will will add red, and then there will be certain, and then things begin to be a little less orderly. But nevertheless, he claims the fact that this is the case, that this is the kind of pattern that we see across cultures, tells us something about the perceptual system, because it is the constraint of the perceptual system that lead us to invent cultural terms to highlight cultural terms in this way. Okay, here I have a little picture that introduces the environment into Waddington's picture. So what we have at the bottom, I don't know if are the genes, and you see the epigenetic network. We see here some kind of phenotype, a physiological phenotype. In this case, we were thinking about a heart, and about a normally functioning heart, more or less. And we have the environment in which the individual lives, which is the umbrella on top. And what we have here is a kind of, there is a kind of, we introduce some kind of disruption, a disruption into the environment. As a result of this disruption, the umbrella has changed, of course. And the result of this disruption, also the network, the epigenetic network has changed. You can compare it, for example, here and here. You see at the very bottom, you see that it is different. The structure is different. But because it has been reorganized, the epigenetic network, the phenotype, the physiological phenotype is the same. It is stable in spite of the fact that we had this big change in the environment, but because this change in the environment led to compensatory effects in the epigenotype, at the level of the physiology, we don't see any difference. This means that the physiology is nicely canalized. Of course, not always will we have this kind of situation. What we see here, the thick arrow shows that there is persistence over time, in this case, over developmental time, of the same phenotype, in spite of this disturbance. The thinner arrows show that the level of persistence at the higher level and at the lower level is much less, because they're thinner. So let us go back to Waddington and to the kind of inputs that we think about when we're thinking about development, and also about heredity. So when we're thinking about development, so what are the inputs that go into development? What is the difference that makes a difference? So obviously genetic variations can make a difference. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. So genetic variation can make a difference to development. Epigenetic, gametic variations, that is, epigenetic variations in the gametes, the sperm and egg, can lead to variations in phenotype, in development. I'm talking about nuclear and cytoplasmic variations in the germline. There can be also epigenetic organismal variations, variations in early care and nourishment that is transmitted through milk, through womb, milk, and so on. And also variations in the microbiomes that the young animal, in this case humans, acquire. Variations, and of course there are variations in the social symbolic aspects of the cultural system and variations in these constructed ecological legacies. This is why we see these four mothers here, the five mothers here. They are representing to us these five different aspects of inputs into development. What is interesting about it is, what I have said now is trivial. Of course, all these things are inputs into development. What is interesting is now we also realize that they are all inputs into heredity. We used to think that only the genetic inputs are important for heredity and all the others are just relegated to development alone. They are not, they cannot be transmitted. We know very well that all these aspects can be transmitted from one generation to the next. So when we are thinking about change, about systems and about change, we have to think about all these aspects, not just one aspect, not just the genetic aspect, but also all the other aspects. When we're thinking about heredity, we have to extend our notion of heredity. So let us think about humans. So Locke said that humans are biosocially becoming beings, developing. And when she was thinking, for example, about the Inuit, she's Canadian, and she thought, well, if we want to understand what's going on with them, both in terms of the diseases that they have and the patterns of behavior and culture, current culture, we have to understand their past, of course, their present, what's going on with them now, and also to see what the future can be if we intervene or do not intervene. Now, we don't always know how to intervene, of course, but the point is that there are some very simple things that people can do and which turn out to be very, very important, for example, in animals. Now, I just want to highlight one thing, which, for example, in Evolution in 4 Dimensions, we did not highlight. We highlighted it only in the second edition. And this is that we have to consider the microbiome too. We know that the microbiome can affect behavior-related phenotypes. And we know that the microbiome can have, and this can have transgenerational effects, both because the microbiome itself can be transmitted from one generation to the next, and because the microbiome can also have effects on the epigenetic landscape of the host. The effect and aspects of this effects can be inherited. So, and when we're thinking about it, we are expecting that, so when we're studying populations, we want to study their genetic, epigenetic, and microbiomic profiles. And the epigenetic profiles and the microbiomes of different human population in social and in gender groups within a culture may be either more shared than their genetic profiles or less shared than their genetic profiles, depending on what we know about the history of these people. But it is very, very important that we do not just look, when we study populations, just at their genetics or just at their epigenetics, but we look at the whole, and of course about their culture, this goes without saying, but also about their microbiomic profiles, because they can give us extra information which would not be available to us otherwise. Now, we all know about what happens in. I'm showing you here horrible things that happen in human societies: wars, famine, deforestation, and poisoning of the environment, and female circumcision. And these are things that can be chronic. I mean, there are countries where you have a chronic state of war. Think about Chechnya. Think about what's happening in the Middle East in some parts. The toxification and the deforestations are going on for a very, very long time throughout the 20th century. And I don't need to tell you how long the female circumcision is going on, and has been and still is going on. Now, these are chronic kind of situations, can be chronic kind of situation. In some cases are chronic. And the question is, what effect do they have? What changes do they make? What difference do they make to the epigenetic, what epigenetic effects do they have? And are these epigenetic effects inherited? Now, we don't know very much about it. For example, I don't know anything about the epigenetic effects of female circumcision. I'm thinking about it. I do know a little bit more about the effects of starvation. I know a little bit about the effects of war, simply because they have been studied, and I know something about the effects of various toxins. And I know this can have transpirational effects. Not always simple transpirational effects. It doesn't always mean that if you have a shock, your offspring will be less resilient to this shock. It could be the case that it will become more resilient to this kind of shock. But we have some examples for both, for those that become less resilient and for those that become more resilient. But we still know rather little about the effects of all kinds of stresses on human populations. And we also know that these things can have, at least we know from animal studies, that these things can have cumulative effects. Cumulative effects do not mean that we cannot reverse it. Actually, we can. And there are more and more studies, thankfully, that show that even heritable epigenetic effects can be reversed with the right kind, in the right kind of condition. This is something very, very important, because a lot of people are very worried that this focus on epigenetic inheritance is leading to some kind of epigenetic determinism or environmental determinism. So we have a lot of information about psychological traumas in animals, in animal studies. A lot is a big word, because we're usually looking at rodents. But we have there is a whole range of studies that are looking at the epigenetic of stress, of stress and its effects on the neurohormonal system, and also looking at the effects on the transformation effects of this. We have some human studies, as I said, not many. It's very difficult to do them because people live for a very long time, and it is possible to reverse epigenetic effects. As I said, thankfully. And there is a lot of migration in human populations and so on. Nevertheless, we do have some studies that show that the effects of trauma can have an epigenetic effect, and that they can have an effect in descendants. Not necessarily the same effect in descendants as they had in the people that actually underwent the trauma. Nevertheless, there is an effect in descendants. And the nature of this effect has to be studied, whether they make people more resilient or whether it makes people more vulnerable. And as I said, in animal studies suggest that both things can happen. And there are all kinds of studies like this. For example, change methylation in the glucocorticoid promoter, which is related with controlled stress sensitivity, is associated with parental post-traumatic stress disorder, and in the children of people who underwent stress. So this is something that in my country, Israel, we have, because we have a lot of people who are the children of Holocaust survivors, and it transpired that they are more vulnerable to PTSD than the non-stress population. And there's also, people also did some studies on men who were traumatized during the Rwandan genocide, and the correlation was found between the methylation level of the glucocorticoid gene promoter and the memory aspects of PTSD, of the post-traumatic stress disorder. And in this case, it was very interesting, because the more methylation they had, the less trauma they had. So it led to resilience. And and there are more studies. I must say that some of the studies are, I'm not very sure about them, because the sample size is not very big, and it's not, and we don't have all the controls that we really need in order to draw conclusions. But there are some studies that are suggesting that in human populations, we do have stress, psychological stress does have effects which are transgenerational. So this is a very, this is not like, this is nutritional stress, and this is very famous case, the famous case of the Dutch, of the Dutch starvation, and when the Nazis had there was a great famine, and because the Nazis blockaded and cut off food and fuel from farms to the city, and a lot of people were affected by this, and about 22,000 died, and many kids were born after their mothers were exposed to starvation. Now, of course, starvation doesn't go on, is not going on its own. Here we're looking at the effects of starvation as if it is only starvation. But these kids were traumatized in all kinds of ways, obviously. They were also psychologically traumatized. So what we see in these kids, the kids of mothers who were starving, is that depending on the trimester of the pregnancy trimester, these kids had different were born thinner, and they were and they had less methylation in an important gene which is called IGF22. If we compare that to their unexposed same-sex siblings, so if we're looking at siblings that were born when the mother was not starving, same mother, same father, we see that there are statistically significant differences. And there is a little bit of an effect even in the third generation, although thankfully it's going away. So, okay. Now, I must say again that there are no systematic studies, epidemiological systematic studies that I'm aware of that really tease apart the way in which psychological stress could affect people's descendants. And because we have to have a lot of data, very, very good health records, and we have to have all the controls. So we have to have many different controls in order to study this kind of thing. And to the best of my knowledge, this has not yet been done, although this is possible. And so let's go back to cultural evolution. We know that epigenetics can affect different aspects of human life, which in turn affect their social life, affect the patterns of behavior, cultural aspects. So how can we think about it? How should we study it after all this? And what my colleagues and I suggested is that we should think about the social aspects and the cultural aspect in terms of a social landscape. Talking about social because it's easier for me to talk about it than to talk about culture, because culture can be something very, very, can relate to very abstract things. For example, we can study the change in poetry styles. I'm not talking about this now. I'm talking about something very, very, very much closer to physiology. So what the social landscape is the dynamic pattern of life in a particular community. And this is the outcome of developmental, ecological, social, and epistemological niche construction. When an individual develops, it develops within this landscape, and it contributes to the collective and cumulative interaction that build it up. Usually we go on and we do the things that we have been taught to do that maintain more or less the fabric, the social fabric. So we can think about a kind of social landscape where we have some kind of a practice. Is somebody told me stop presenting? Okay, never mind. Anyway, so we can think about the kind of social landscape with the trajectory of the developmental paths of individuals as they become socialized. So I have become socialized to be a university professor. Okay, my trajectory was a little bit weird, but that's when I ended up. I ended being a professor in a university, teaching students and transmitting knowledge. The knowledge I'm transmitting is not exactly the knowledge I have been taught, but never mind. Nevertheless, I'm still within this general attractor to which my development has led, which is part of the fabric of society, which by my activity, in a sense, in an important sense, I'm maintaining. Maybe I'm creating little variations, but whether or not they will have any effect, only the future can tell, and this depends on many, many, many other factors. Because like the genetic landscape, epigenetic landscape, social landscape is also dependent on many, many, many different factors. And so I am in some kind, I myself, I'm situated in some kinds of, when I'm situated in some kinds of social attraction, in a particular, I have a particular role in society, in my little society, in my little aspect of society, and I'm maintaining it. I have not been kicked out. And I have been allowed to do what I'm doing and to promote the ongoing the processes that build up higher education, in my case in Israel. And of course, I'm not living in a complete bubble, although to some extent it is. My kind of social, the structure in which I'm living is part of a larger social landscape. And I'm interacting with different people and different aspects of this larger social landscape. So, you know, if you're thinking about this here, maybe I'm here, and one can get into this attractor in which I'm living and into which one can be socialized in many, many, many different ways. There are several trajectories leading to it. And from this particular attractor, one can easily, or sometimes easily and sometimes not at all easily, sometimes it's practically impossible, also go to other attractors and change one's own developmental trajectory to some extent. Although once you're sort of settled down in a particular attractor, you stay there. So here it is, we see that, you know, different individuals are sort of socialized into society, and as they are socialized, as they are doing the kind of thing that are expected from them, they're also deepening the kind of the developmental trajectories through which they are going. And it seems like this can go on for a very long time. So I don't know how much time do I have? I wanted to give you 3 examples, so I'll go through them very quickly.
Yeah, you have time for for a couple of examples.
A couple of examples. So, okay, here is one example. And this is an example of urban poverty in the USA. And the point about this example is that that there is a cycle of poverty. And in spite of the fact that there is quite a lot of social mobility relative to what there was, nevertheless, people who are born into urban poverty in the United States, to parents who are poor, tend to be poor themselves. And the question is why? There are many, many people who are trying to change this situation, and it's very difficult to change it. So why is it so difficult? Is there a particular factor? If we will have a good school, if we will, what can we do in order to change this? So the point is that there are many, many factors that come together and lead to this kind of situation. So there are social structural factors that include the kinds of job available, the education of parents, the quality of the school in the inner city, the structure of the state welfare system, and so on and so forth. And all these are factors are leading to the perpetuation of poverty, because the kind of jobs available, the education of parents and so on, are not helping the kids to escape the system. There are also some biological and epigenetic factors in this case. Not in all cases there are, but in this case there is cheap food, junk food. There is, in the societies, there is often quite a lot of violence, alcohol and drug consumption in many of the societies, and all this have effects on the parents and can have effects on the children. And this too will contribute to the perpetuation of poverty. And once somebody did make it, once somebody did escape against many odds, the kind of society in which he or she lived, they do not go back. They disappear from. They don't want to have very much to do usually with the society. So there's no positive input into it. The other thing is that when you're looking at the geographical, at the geography of the urban environment, you see that poor people live together, not dispersed. And there are geographical boundaries which, again, help to keep this poverty cycle going. So all these things are important. And when we're thinking about these things, and we're thinking about how to change things, we have to look at how they interact and how there are, which are the most important inputs to the positive feedbacks that are formed. So we're looking at the network structure of poverty, and we're trying to identify the hubs, but not just the hubs where there are a lot of inputs converge, also where there are positive feedbacks, which help to sustain this network. This is what we want. We are looking at the regulatory structure of the social network. Once we understand this, we will know much better how to intervene. Usually we'll have to intervene at several points because there are many problems, but there may be some problems which are more important than others in terms of their contribution to the self-sustaining loops that are formed in this condition. So this is one thing. Here we have something else, and this is the maintaining very thriving, growing Orthodox Jewish community in Los Angeles, in spite of the fact that that around it there are non-Jewish and very, what they would call transgressive young youth culture. So how do they do it? So first of all, in a community, which has quite good, not quite firm geographical limits, and they are going to the same places, the same schools, and so on, and the children are going to the same place. They have the same institutional frameworks, and they are creating all the time participation in this frameworks, so that every person has multiple obligations that all the time they are pulled towards. And there are many of those. So people don't have much time for anything else. They all the time participate in the community and doing things that maintain the community. And also, because they are very similar to others, they are demarcating themselves from others by wearing particular clothes, and in this way they transform their marginality into something that helps them to feel as a community. They are different from the others and they have their own community. And they are very important public worship situations that create interactions that sustain their communal life and generate a lot of communal meaning in their lives. So this is very, very shortly. One can, of course, write a book about it, and the book was by Ida Tavori. And the last example that I want to give you is a spread of sign language. And here we have a very strong genetic factor. The genetic factor is, we're talking about sign language among people who are who, because of a genetic reason, are deaf-mute. So what we know, this is the observation, that the frequency of connexin deaf people, connexin is a particular gene that is very, very commonly mutation in when you're homozygous to this mutation, you are deaf, and this is one of the most common reasons for being deaf. The frequency of connexin deaf people doubled during the last 200 years in the USA, and Interestingly, so did the use of sign language. So sign language was introduced at the beginning of the 19th century, and it altered the reproductive pattern of deaf people. First of all, deaf people could communicate. Very often, deaf people before the introduction of the sign language were considered to be retarded, because they couldn't hear and they couldn't communicate. So, and because they were considered retarded, very often their fitness was low. They didn't marry or they didn't have children, they didn't have families that could thrive. And the combined effects of relaxed selection, so there was no selection against the connexin gene, and linguistic homogamy can explain the high frequency of connexin deafness. What is linguistic homogamy? Linguistic homogamy means that once you know sign language, you communicate with other deaf people and also with your family. Some of them are carrier of the gene in sign language. And because you are because the people with whom you communicate are the people with whom you are likely to, where you are likely to find mates, you will be more likely to marry people from your schoolwork you communicate with whom you communicate in sign language than the general population. As a result, the frequency of homozygous for the connexin gene will increase in the population. And this is a very beautiful example that shows how cultural evolution can drive genetic evolution in 200 years. So here it is. So what we see here, this is the increase in homozygotes. And it's not an increase in the gene, it's the increase in the number of homozygotes. There is a small increase in the gene, but the main increase is the increase in homozygous people. So here we have the percent of homozygotes, and here we have the gene frequency, which went slightly up, but not very, very much. Okay, so we can see that there can be multiple factors that can drive a particular process. That can be, and what I was focusing on was in the first two examples is on maintenance. How do you dynamically maintain a particular good or bad? It can be very disastrous, as is the case with the urban poverty. But how this social structure and social dynamics is maintained in spite, in this case, of being not good, being actually very deleterious to the people. Nevertheless, it is maintained, not because there is somebody evil who is maintaining it, but because of the dynamics of the system. Of course, you can talk about politics and about capitalism, and you will be right to do that. But this in itself, we have to unpack it to understand how this affects this dynamics. And then we can think about how about the change, for example, a change introduced by a new kind of technology technology practice, sign language, a kind of communication technology, a new communication technology, which has changed the ability of a certain group of people to communicate, and which has led to a change in the genetic constitution of the population. So, okay, so there are many, many questions which we can ask when we're thinking in this way. And I have covered very, very little part of what we can say about this epigenetic developmental approach. First of all, we can ask, well, what is the role of new technologies, especially communication technologies, in changing social landscapes? Which network nodes will be affected? How does migration change things? What is the role of conflict? When is conflict a vehicle of change rather than of dynamic stability? Because conflict can lead to the same kind of structure being maintained. How are social, cultural, individual cognitive process related? Is the social kind of a posteriori and the cognitive individual of the individuals a priori, like Durkheim said. So you know, we have a certain set of beliefs, which then is transmitted to, which become the a priori of the individual's kind of way of thinking, but which evolved culturally. And cultural changes can lead to changes in individual cognition, and the prime example is literacy. And now we have an additional example, the internet has changed a lot. Now, when we think about long-term effects, can we think about genetic accommodation processes? And here, there are some very interesting recent examples from domestication studies that, if you will want, I will be happy to talk about. And and then at last, how should we model cultural evolution? And there are many ways in which we can model it, and I think that we have to use different models in order to get a better general picture. So I thank you, and I apologize for talking too much.
Thank you, Eva, for this very inspiring talk. I would like to proceed now with the first response by Jo and Sander. Jo and Sander, the floor is yours.
All right, let me get this up. Can you see this?
I can see it, yeah.
Yes.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you indeed for the inspiring seminar. Jo is a philosopher and I'm a psychologist, so we'll try to respond. And our response is basically inspired also by your latest book with Ginsberg, which we read with great interest. And where, as in today's talk, you emphasize this challenge between the stabilization or the canalization and the plasticity. We want to take that as a starting point for something that we'd like you to think with us about. So if we use James' words, which you quote in your book, then if I read it, the dilemma in regard to the nervous system seems in short to be of the following kind. We may construct one which will react infallibly and certainly, but it will then be capable of reacting to very few changes in the environment, and it will fail to be adapted to all the rest. We may, on the other hand, construct a nervous system that potentially adapted to respond to an infinite variety of minute features in the situation, but its fallibility will then be as great as its elaboration. And we can never be sure that its equilibrium will be upset in the appropriate direction. In short, a high brain may do many things, but may do each of them at a very slight hint, but its hair trigger organization makes of it a happy-go-lucky hit or miss affair. It is as likely to go crazy as to do the crazy as the sane thing any given moment. A low brain does very few things, and in doing them perfectly forfeits all other use. So the performances of a high brain are like dice thrown forever on a table. Unless they be loaded, what chance is there that the highest number will turn up oftener than the lowest? So it's a very long quote, but it represents this plasticity canalization issue very well, I think. And it also lives on this challenge also lives on in a different guise in the explore-exploit dilemma in psychology and current neuroscience. It's also called explore-constraint dilemma for obvious reasons, because in a nutshell, it's about how to avoid a too greedy, over-constrained exploitation of things of known motivational value. And on the other hand, how to avoid getting lost in exploring or learning the structure of the world in an under-constrained way without clear eye for the goals, without clear eye for the things of emotion, of motivational value. And recent neurocomputational theories, they propose solutions for this dilemma in reinforcement learning, for example, or in active inference, the free energy principle. We have more sympathy for the latter because it has this principled account of exploration, but also especially because there's a way in it for learning what to want instead of just learning what is or learning how to get rewards. There's an example here by Seth's group. So if we go into updated terms on this plasticity canalization challenge, and we have to say that with great learning power comes great responsibility. So how to ensure that this learning allowed by a big brain keeps its direction and stability. In your terms in your book, with forceful universal associative learning, the kind of learning that you associate with complex creatures that might be conscious even. So with that forceful learning comes a forceful need to constrain, new ways to constrain this learning towards compounds with motivational value as you describe it. So aside from the plasticity, and the question is for us, I think, whether rethinking is required of what motivational value is, and that is of course grounded in evolutionary or biological value, but potentially orthogonal to it, because indeed none of us is satisfied when we point to reward regions or some evolutionary relevance to explain value. That's not enough. So could it be, we wonder, could it be that plasticity is not merely in building ever more complex compound structures, knowledge structures, but that there is that it is in the acquisition and the flexible setting of new goals, new things of motivational value, so that we're really autotelic creatures, which means that we set our own goals. This is quite a mysterious feature maybe of humans and maybe some other animals. And how is this kickstarted, or are we born with it, and what is needed for that? So the problem, the problem we have is with this learning explosion, would it be feasible without the form of social canalization? So is a social dimension then not a constitutive element in setting these goals and creating new goals beyond what you call the Popperian creatures that let their hypothesis die in their stead? So there's a necessary social loading of the dice, and of course your lecture today was already part of that, as well as your paper that we show here, the reproduction of the social. But we were thinking about childhood and how it's sometimes described, for example, by Alison Kopnick, as a protracted and protected exploratory phase. So preceding the more goal-directed and the more exploitative adulthood, and how do we get to be this autotelic, this fully autotelic creatures? That seems to be an issue that needs to be addressed, and we found some inspiration in a psychological study for that. And for that, to explain that, let's move to the philosopher, actually.
Thank you, Sander. So actually this was Sander's proposal to look for an answer, and it's a study by Jeremy McVicker Hunt, an old study, but a very telling one, according to us. So basically, to summarize it, children in an orphanage in Tehran were either, well, the goal was to get to a stabilized rate of language acquisition, and there were waves of children. Some children, they had no stimulation from the caregiver, or a very strict, rigid simulation scripted on beforehand by the researchers. Or the wave 5 children, as it said here on the slide, they basically got a caregiver who was much more flexibly, so they got more time, well, not absolute more time, but they got more leeway to interact with the children, so they could coo back and whatever, so they could really respond to the children. So you see on the left the pictures in that paper, very interesting paper, of waves 1 and 2. On the right, waves 5. And without going into detail on the pictures, but that's what Mr. Hunt said, which is in the middle. Although the whole setup was made in order to stabilize or speed up the stabilized rate of language acquisition, what they found in this research is that there was something on top which differentiated the wave 5 children, as it said in the research. And one of the most apparent thing is that instead of just getting quicker to language, which they also did, they basically had a better sense of initiative. They could take more autonomy, a little bit in the direction of what Sander said. They seem to be more autotelic or more quickly autotelic than the other children. And Sander, next slide, because I don't have the control. So basically what and I'm not going to read all of this, but basically it seemed out of this study, and that's also what the researchers said in the paper, is that somehow by scaffolding and by going with the children in a certain direction, these children had a certain trust in their own action. So they could make predictions and they could somehow have trust that somehow they could experiment with that and that it would go all right. So basically there was a sense of optimism and there was a sense of risk-taking in these children. And this was not just, let's say, any social dimension, because the other children also got some social feedback, but it was really kind of a social dimension, which was a trust-inspiring social dimension. And what we think, going to a sketch of an answer, and what we want to have your opinion, obviously, is that there seems to be some, not just canalization to a certain stable trait, but there seems to be a canalization towards some kind of plasticity or safe plasticity, a plasticity in the social or the cultural dimension. And that this trust giving by the carers is a crucial element to that, to go beyond just having hypotheses die in your stead, which is still a very, let's say, coarse way of judging a character, but really to be able to make a hypothesis, make a prediction, and feel like you're safe to take the risk and safe to find something new. Next slide, Sander. So basically what we try to get to is, based on your picture, can we get to a sense where we have a naturalized way of looking at the development of ethical creatures? We don't say human beings, because why would it be only human beings? But ethical creatures, and we quote here philosopher Victoria McGeer, which has worked a lot on the various types of human emotions. And you can read the quote, but I'm just going to read the last sentence. And there she says, one could not become a properly human agent, and therefore an agent who hopes, because she thinks hope is a crucial aspect of a human agent, of an ethical agent. One could not become a properly human agent, and therefore an agent who hopes, without a scaffolding of others. So she interestingly combines something which is a very individual characteristic, which is to hope and to be optimistic and to try to dare to do something new, and linking it to the fact that others, without saying, boy, you have to do this or that, basically, to give it in a very American way, have your back. So going to the next slide, we try to formulate this as a kind of a question. So on top of, as you say in Sensitive Soul, universal associative learning, on top of heritably varying traits, could we see this kind of social conversation beyond just a mere stabilizing of a trait, but basically allowing, as this picture tries to convey, hopefully in a more or less understandable fashion, where actually the individual agent has some leeway, obviously not a complete leeway, but some leeway in maybe looking to other attractors, looking over the hill, so to speak, and say, okay, I instead of being regarded as deaf people were for a long time as somehow retarded, as you said, but maybe looking over it and seeing maybe I can develop something in another way. And so maybe this kind of trust is a necessary ingredient in a naturalistic story, going from universal associative learning to something like ethical creatures, where trust is a key element to allow initiative of an agent who then basically can invent new things and can inspire others maybe to go along, and so on and so forth. So that's my conclusion, or our conclusion. So I don't know, Christine, if you want Eva to respond now quickly or after Emma's presentation.
Eva, you can choose yourself. Would you like to respond now?
Yeah, it's a very a lot. I have a lot to say, so I'm afraid that I will take all the time. So maybe it's I don't know. Whatever you prefer, whatever you want.
Maybe we continue with Emma, and then you can reply to both the.
Yeah.
Okay, I will share my content now. I think it should be okay like this. Okay, thank you for this very rich talk.
We still see your comments now.
Ah, you see the comments. Then I will just do the normal presentation mode. Yeah, there we go. Thank you for this talk. I have a philosophy background, and in this short response, I will mainly focus.
Now we don't see your presentation at all.
No, it's disappeared.
Is it there again?
Yes, but with the notes.
With the notes. Then I will, let's hope that this helps. Without the notes now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. There we go. So in your, I'm sorry for the troubles, but now I can really start. Thank you for this talk. And in your talk, as well as in your paper on cultural epigenetics, you emphasize that epigenetics research on socially induced deleterious effects has social and political implications as well. And to quote from your paper, you write that if, for example, long-lasting ethnic conflict, starvation, or persistently low socioeconomic status, like you now also told us about, can induce detrimental cognitive and emotional effects in members of human populations, it could aggravate and reinforce social problems for generations to come, because the epigenetic changes may lead to the reconstruction of the deleterious phenotypes. And then you also write that recognizing this creates an urgent need to understand how to manipulate the developmental system and neutralize or even reverse those effects. So I think all of us present, or most of us, can agree on the existence of this urgent need, at least when we're talking about effects of which it's relatively uncontroversial to say that they are indeed deleterious. So I think one of the many laudable aspects of your work is that it contributes to our understanding of how epigenetics plays a role in various kinds of structural injustice as well. So I think in that sense, your work is a great starting point for venturing into the normative domain by asking, for example, how should we bring about the needed social change? And also, who should take up the responsibility to remedy and avoid such injustices? And of course, how we distribute these responsibilities is a political question. And I think it's also a philosophical one. So we need to distinguish proper sources of responsibility and as ways in which agents are connected to the injustice and the injustices that justify that we hold them responsible. And there are various contemporary global issues that require such an analysis of responsibility distribution. So climate justice and systemic racism, I think, are the two that are now mostly the most studied ones. But epigenetic knowledge doesn't just pose an additional challenge to these others. It turns out, as you also show in some nice examples, that they are very much entangled and intertwined, all these issues. So I want to take the example of debates about slavery reparations. There are already some proponents of such reparations who use findings from epigenetics research to support their case. So an example I found is of Dr. Indira Martin, who wrote an opinion piece in a Bahamian newspaper in 2015, in which she argues that there is a wealth of data from biomedical studies that support the notion that trauma can be inherited from one generation to the next. And it is likely, she says, that modern-day Bahamians who never experienced slavery nonetheless continue to suffer the biomedical effects of the British regime of slavery and colonialism. And she concludes her opinion piece by saying that reparations are clearly due to the Bahamas for the damage done on the collective health of the nation during the Ma'afa, the transatlantic slave trade, and subsequent colonial era. So I wonder to what extent research in epigenetics can help us answer such difficult social and political questions about responsibility distribution. One might show through epigenetics that there are relevant biological links between the victims of slavery and their descendants, but it seems much harder, for example, to use insights in cultural epigenetics to identify who should be held responsible for this. So I was thinking perhaps a better understanding of cultural epigenetics and dynamic systems theory can at least give us some useful insights about what direction to look in. So based on your work, I formulated a few points of attention, and I think to some extent you formulated them yourself already and better, but I will go through them quickly. So the first one is that social landscapes are complex, of course, and so is achieving social change. So you argue that genetic, epigenetic, ecological, institutional, and symbolic factors all contribute to the formation of the landscape and its dynamic stability. So that means we need to keep in mind how much things need to change before we can speak of durable change. And this seems to point us away from any answer to this responsibility question that is focused on one or a few individuals or institutions or even groups. It seems that people and institutions across our whole society need to alter their behavior and the choices they make. And thus, it seems we need a nuanced account of collective responsibility. For example, perhaps we don't need to shouldn't limit collective responsibility to state responsibility. And such a nuanced account would ideally also acknowledge the dynamics of collective responsibility, so that collectives are formed, they dissolve, their members change. In short, they are not very stable entities. And then capacity for remediation seems to be important. When confronted with injustices, we are used to investigating who are to blame for them. But finding a causal connection to the wrongdoing is perhaps not always that important. It might be more fruitful in some cases to avoid focusing too much on blaming specific agents and instead focus on remedying existing situations, regardless of how they came into existence. So in such an approach, it seems that capacity to bring about change becomes the most important source of responsibility. And then the final point for now, that knowledge of epigenetics is not widespread, neither is knowledge of social landscapes. So knowledge of the mechanisms involving existing injustices is, of course, a prerequisite for any ability to change the situation. But the complexity of issues we discussed here doesn't make them very easy to grasp. And that leads me to ask, how much knowledge can we expect people to acquire, and in what ways should we facilitate this? To conclude, as you and Marion Lamb wrote in Evolution in 4 Dimensions, simplification is fine, but it has to be of the right kind. It is no good if it misleads you or limits you too much. So this was a short response. I'm wondering what you think of these few points. To which extent you think knowledge of epigenetics and social landscapes can help us deal with existing injustices? And when you argue that harmful existing social and political circumstances need to be changed, to whom is your argument directed, if to anyone in particular? So I look forward to hearing your comments, and also I look forward to the rest of the discussion with other participants. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, so that's it? I have to answer? Okay, so let me start with the more abstract, to some extent, points that the first two scholars presented here. So one of the things, it is true that the relationship between plasticity and canalization are very, very interesting. If you're thinking about the Waddington picture, especially the picture that I presented, I don't want to show it anymore because I want to see it. When you think about it, what is happening in order to keep something stable, you have to do a lot of changes at the underlying level or the overlying level. So, for example, if you want to keep the temperature of your body constant, and you are not, and you don't have an internal mechanism for that, let's say you're a reptile, what will you do? You will, if it's too hot, you will go to the shade. If it's too cold, you will go to the sun. You will do all kinds of things. You will be more active or less active. You will do all kinds of things in order to keep yourself, to keep the temperature at the physiologically relevant level, right? So in order to have canalization, you have to have plasticity because it's a dynamic system. So plasticity is up. So these two aspects are not distinct from each other. Plasticity, canalization requires plasticity. Now, plasticity too requires canalization. How? Let me give you an example. Let's take language, for example. Language gives us enormous plasticity, unbelievable plasticity. Yet it is based on certain things which have to be in place. For example, we have to be able to do sequence learning, right? We have to be able to imitate certain things, certain cognitive capacities have to be in place for this to happen. Yes, if we don't have these capacities, we can overcome it to some extent, but only to some extent. Now, I want to say something about the very interesting paper that you found, which I would be very grateful if you can send it to me because I didn't know it. So it's very, very interesting and very, and not very surprising, in fact. Because one of the things, I was talking with people who are doing, who are behaviorists, who are working with autistic kids. And they are talking about frame theory, right? What they do is they teach the children to use analogical thinking through behaviorism. So if this, then that. Now, the thing, what is very interesting about it is that, of course, when the children begin to use language, very often what happens to them, not always, but very often, what happens to them is that they gain also confidence in other aspects. Why? Because, for example, language, if I ask a question and I get an answer, I know that if I ask a question, I get an answer. I learned something about causality. If I ask for something and this something is given to me, again, there is a lot of causal learning that is happening there. So causal learning, something that Gopnik has been writing about and doing quite a lot, is very, very fundamental, is part of this package of capacities and of related capacities that we as human beings have. So, for example, when we're thinking about human beings, we're thinking about not just one thing, we're thinking about their ability for something that we call theory of mind. I don't like this term. I think it's unfortunate, but never mind. We all know what we're talking about. So we have some kind of theory of mind. We know that somebody has beliefs that may be different from our own. We have the ability for causal learning. We have the ability for analogical reasoning, which, by the way, was very central to James' thinking. although he didn't develop it very much, except in the principles of psychology. He devotes some time for it, but not too much. Then we have the ability for emotional control. We are not hyperactive like chimpanzees. When you're looking at how chimpanzees behave, they look like very, very, very hyperactive kids. And even bonobos, although they're less hyperactive, and I think that's why they learn more easily. So it will be very interesting to see what, if we could do the experiment, what would happen if we give them a little bit of Ritalin. But I think that this ability to control the emotions and to also to control your to withhold immediate satisfaction is very, very important. Now, so it's the control of emotions. It's also the control that it's of course motor control, very fine motor control that we have. In the evolution of the hand is an amazing thing, and manual dexterity. It's not just tool making; it's manual dexterity which is so important. And all these things are correlated. Now most of them appeared before language. So I think, and I agree, and alloparenting, which is something that is unique to us among the great apes. Of course, many monkeys have it, but none of the great apes have it. The fact that we're looking that the other family members are looking. So all these things are related, and they probably have been there in Homo erectus. So Hardy said we were emotionally modern before we were cognitively modern. Mm-hmm. That this distinction between emotion and cognition is good. As I see it, it's one package. It's always going together. But I think that, and then language came and evolved on this basis of these humans, which were human in almost every sense, except they didn't have language. But language did change us. It did change us very, very, in many, many, many different ways that we don't, I think that it was one of the drivers of a further control of emotions, because we have to understand that what we hear isn't, even if we can imagine it, we should not be afraid of it, because it doesn't happen here and now, even if we have a very, very good imagination. And this is not something we should take for granted at all. And of course, language also creates new emotions in the sense that I can make you cry or laugh. And I can also create moral indignation and all kinds of things which are specific to collective kind of interactions, which language facilitates enormously. So I think that now what language created, I think that there were already societal values before language. There were rituals, there were things that we, as a we, do. But language created the history and the myth and the future and the utopia or dystopia or whatever. And in doing that, it created a very strong, it created a set of values. Suddenly, we care about values such as the beautiful, the right, the right and the wrong, the true and untrue. I mean, all these things don't exist in other animals. Many, many things exist. They don't have this kind of, they don't do things because this is just, or this is true for the truth of things. These are values that we have, and they are organizing values of human societies. And they are the strong attractors of ourselves as humans. Yes, we sometimes do not hid them, but we know that they are there. Yes, and they are, and I think without them, we would not be human beings. So I think it is really the values and goals that are created when a new inheritance systems and then when a new kind of teleological systems comes into being. So when we're thinking about biological entities such as plants, their values, if you want, goals are to survive and to reproduce, full stop. Now, this is a common ground for everybody. Now you come to the animals, those that feel, those that have feeling. For them, it is the satisfaction of needs and the avoidance of aversions that become value. how they are related to the general thing of survival of reproduction? Yes, they must be related, of course. They cannot be unrelated completely, but they are not related in simple ways. In the same ways that our values as humans for the good, the just, the true, are also have to have something to do with survival of reproduction. But it's very, very far from it. This is a particular way of living we have, which is very, very different from any other kind of way of living. And it opens up its own domain of plasticity and canalization. So when we're thinking about plasticity and canalization, we have to think about what are we talking about? What kind of animal are we talking about? We're talking about the human animal. What identifies us as humans? Yes, we have biology. Of course, we have biology. And God help us if we don't, if we neglect it. But we as human beings would identify us as human beings and not as rats who have epigenetic inheritance galore, and or plants who have even more. We have more examples. Is that we have this symbolic system, this symbolic values, and they are very, very important drivers, and they are reconstructed every generation. They're cultural. They're created by culture. They're constructed by culture. But they are very, very strong attractors, and that's why you're right. I don't want to talk about, yes, we have this is good, this is bad, this hurts me, this gives me pleasure. What gives me pleasure? There are many things that give me pleasure, which can be very, very strange for a dog. And there may be some things that give pleasure for a dog that I don't recognize, but I think that there are more things that the dog will not recognize than I would not recognize in a dog, because I share with the dog so much. So I think that yes, that every time that we sort of, during evolution, a new kind of teleological and system evolves, it creates its own space of plasticity and canalization. And the values are very strong canalizers. So I'm not sure that if it answered you, but I think but I hope it's going in the direction in which you are. So
yeah.
So language, for example, is a good example. Language is both allowing incredible plasticity, because we can talk about everything on the one hand. On the other hand, it is bound by certain rules. I'm not talking about Chomsky rules. I'm talking about much more general kind of rules, right? By certain cognition. So, okay, so I don't know if there is anything that you would like to say.
I think one thing is, I wonder whether in development, like, of course, language acquisition goes together with this ability to become autotelic, to set your own goals. But I wonder whether these two things are really, are there cases that we can find of creatures that don't use language but still have advanced learning systems, and that become this kind of learning, this kind of goal setting creatures, even in humans that are not literate or don't have any language?
I think yes. I think that, of course, but it will be much more limited. I think that our ancestors, Homo erectus, yes, were incredibly clever people, and they were humans, and they had goals, but their goals were limited to some extent. They had goals in the sense of maybe they had rituals, probably, or some kinds of rituals, and they had a very strong feeling of being together, of being a group. And this being a group and belonging to a group was, and wanting the group to thrive was a kind of value which went beyond the values of a herd of elephants. Although, I have a huge respect for a herd of elephants. But it was something. It was already something different, and it was associated with rituals. It was associated with a different type of communication. I'm building on people like Donald, Berlin Donald, Fritz Stages and the Evolution of the Mind, but not only him. So I think that they had, and I think that also other animals have I think that the chimpanzees have goals, but they're limited goals. Yes, what language did is it just opened up a realm of so many possible goals, and yet the values were not that the actual values that sort of direct you towards these goals. They are rather limited, in the same way that the goals, the values that direct an animal that can feel are rather limited. But of course, an animal can feel many things about many different. If an animal can feel, it can fear a blue flower because it was associated in its history with something nasty, right? So the actual what an animal actually learns, what an animal will want to avoid or will want to approach, will be enormously expanded once this animal can feel and can learn in the way that we have described in our book. It has this kind of open-ended learning. But the goals that it will have will be the values that it will have, will be more limited. They will be strong canalizers. In the same way that we have values as humans, these values are written up in every moral system on the planet, and there are not that many of them. Yes, this is quite interesting. And we all understand each other as moral beings. This is also very interesting and not to be taken for granted. So I don't know if I answered you, but I tried.
Yeah. I think the capacity for play is also something that shows the setting of goals, autonomous, flexible setting of goals, and you see that in some other animals. So there is a start of that.
You see you have precursor for everything. Animals play, even reptiles play,
right?
And probably fish play too. And so you have it everywhere. The question that and you have the precursors of these things. But in the humans, a lot of things came together in a particular way. And the way that they came together, and then with language, what language did to this already highly sophisticated non-linguistic or relatively non-linguistic, because this was also a process, it really did create something very, very different. I think that I have a great sympathy for people who see the continuity and the similarity between us and the great apes. I really do, and I understand them. I mean, one of the things that I like doing is watching animals, and I can, you can, after a while, you can sort of feel like you're the animal almost, and identify with it. But we are very, very different. But in my opinion, we are very, very different creatures. And this difference has all kinds of aspects. I'll just give you one, maybe, which I just was thinking about recently. That's why I'll tell you about it, which I was not thinking about it very much earlier. It's one of the things that language does. There's something called linguistic overshadowing. Language has opens up a lot of things, but it also closes things. For example, linguistic overshadowing is the phenomenon whereby if you see a crime, let's say 10 people who see a crime, and you ask 5 of them to describe what they have seen, to describe the person, and 5 of them you don't ask. And then you present the person to the people and you ask them to identify it. Those who described it in words will be worse in identifying, because words are abstractions. They sort of put you in a cage of categories, and they have some suppressive power, it seems, although it is reversible on the ability for perceptual memory.
That's really interesting.
It's very interesting. It's one of the things that language does. It does all kinds of things, a whole range of things. Language opens and closes. But we are, because of this, because of language, we are different from the Homo erectus. And Homo erectus was very different from the chimpanzee, completely different in many, many aspects of its life, from what we can understand from the fossil record. So Okay, so now I want to answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and you asked about epigenetic knowledge and about reparation and about collective responsibility. So I want to say just one thing, that we are, in the beginning, people were very excited about epigenetic inheritance, and rightly so, because suddenly there was a system of inheritance they didn't know anything about, and suddenly there it is, and the inheritance of acquired characters can happen. So people were very excited about it, and rightly so, because you have to describe it. And they were less focused on the question of how can you reverse it, because of course mutations are difficult to reverse, right? Unless you do some CRISPR. But if you don't, it's very difficult to reverse a mutation. And now with epigenetics, it transpires that it's not difficult at all. I mean, you know, there are the common sense things that we don't need epigenetics for them at all. We all know what is good for people. No, you give them enough food, you give them security, you give them a little bit of love and care. You don't deprive, you give them education, clean air, clean water. That's it. And the opportunity to explore and to play and to, you know, to do all these things that humans need and to learn. You do this, and 95% of the problems will disappear. Maybe 5% will not. And you know, you really don't need epigenetics for that. All the epigenetics tells you is that it can show you that if you don't do this, it will persist and get worse. So now there are experiments that people are doing exactly to show this. So they take a case where there is epigenetic inheritance. You induce something in an animal, and this is inherited even when the inducing stimulus is no longer present. Okay? So for example, you stress the poor thing, and then it is neurotic, and its children are neurotic, and its grandchildren are neurotic. Okay? A mouse. This is Mansouri and her group did it. Now you take this, and you do it on male rats, because you don't want the complications of the female with all the roots of inheritance that you can have. With the males, you have very few roots, okay, in rats, because there's no paternal care there. So you take the rat whom you stressed, and now you give it an enriched environment and everything. And lo and behold, what happens? He becomes less neurotic, much less neurotic, or non-neurotic, and his children are okay. So the methylation has reversed to normal. Okay, this is what happened. Now there was a recent experiment by people who found epigenetic inheritance of fear conditioning in rats. You read this? So they associated some smell with foot shock. Feet shock, okay? They gave some shock to the feet, poor things. And of course they learned very quickly, and their offspring didn't need to learn very much. Just smelled the smell, and they froze, okay? Now, okay, very interesting. They looked at all the genes that may be responsible, and they saw that something was methylated or non-methylated in the germline and small RNAs and whatnot. Okay, great. Now, what they did was they did extinction experiments. So you learned that this thing is that the smell is a bad thing because it is associated with shock, and then you learn that it isn't, that it's okay, right? And what happened? They were okay, and the offspring were okay. So you can extinguish. So these things are plastic. It's only that we have to know what to do, right? And most of the things that we know what to do most of the time. It's a political thing. What you have to do is to stop. If you stress people and you starve them and you harm them physically, you mutilate them, and so on. Of course, they will be stressed, and if this will go on generation after generation, yes, it will get worse probably, because the epigenetic marks can accumulate also. Fortunately, we also know from some experiment in mice that even if they accumulate, they can be erased. if you stop the stressing and give them a normal environment. Fortunately, we know it in one case, so we can't generalize very much, but we know it. So I think that it is very clear at a very common sense level what we have to do in order to make the world a better place in every sense, including the epigenetic sense. Now, what about what we could do? I think one of the things that we could do is to make people aware that this kind of changes really are important, not only for them, but for their children and for their grandchildren. To make people aware of this, because people do care about their children and grandchildren, usually. And so I think it is our responsibility to do that. And you said that epigenetic knowledge is complicated. I guess, here I gave you a lecture, and it was not exactly a popular lecture because I assumed quite a lot of knowledge on your part. But I gave a lot of lectures and I taught people who don't know any biology, zero. And it's not difficult for them to understand. We think it's difficult, but it isn't. It took quite a long time for people to sort of get socialized in their heads into the idea that it's all genetics. It's not natural for people to think like this. I mean, why should they think like this? Most people see two identical twins, but identical twins in their lives, and they know they're not the same, for example. I mean, it took quite a long time for people to sort of get accustomed to the idea that everything about heredity is epigenetic, is genetic, sorry, the kind of Dawkins thing. Yes, development is okay, but heredity, it's only genetic. No, most people believed in the inheritance of acquired characters. Very difficult it was to change it. Yes, they believed in all kinds of nonsense, but we also believe in all kinds of nonsense. Now, right? And one of the nonsense we believe in is that all inheritance is genetic. It's very easy to explain this to people with some examples, with good examples, and with common sense. Of course, they will understand it. Now, you don't have to explain to them the biochemical mechanisms. Anyway, they will change. In 2 years' time, you will look back at what you wrote and you will say, "Oh God, yeah." But I don't think it's very difficult. And I think what we have to do is to talk to people at the eye-to-eye level. People are intelligent. People can understand everything. And you only have to do it in a way that with a lot of examples, and people will go back to their own experiences, and it will make sense to them. This is my experience anyway. I found that it's not difficult for people to understand it. And we as human beings, it's very difficult for us to understand probability, which is really very simple. But it's not very difficult for us to understand a story, which is really complicated. So we have an ability as humans to understand episodes and complex structures and things like this. And I think that I don't think that this is a problem. Of course, when we're talking to policymakers, we have to give them more concrete examples and show them the science and impress them with the science, if you want. It's a rhetoric, it's a kind of rhetoric, but we need it. I mean, we're not lying, or we're telling the truth, but we have to tell it in a way that is effective. We have to make these people aware that, this really have implications for generations. So, but I think we can and should do it. And I think, as you said yourself, that who is responsible. This thing that I didn't read this woman who wrote about the Bahama things. I don't know. I am always afraid that this is kind of not very helpful and quite misleading rhetoric. I don't know what these people in the Bahama, how they lived. If they did have a normal life, more or less, and they are not anymore under, they are okay. The chances are most of them are okay. Yes, I'm first-generation Holocaust survivor. Maybe I have some little twists in my head, but believe me, I'm much better than my mother. Yeah, much better. And all my generation, most of the people that I know with whom I was in touch are Holocaust survivors. So yes, second generation Holocaust survivor, we have some problems for all kinds of reasons. And maybe also epigenetic, by the way. It's not impossible, but there is a huge difference between me and my mom and other people who went through this horror. And this is because we were brought up in a society and in a way that didn't sort of that really gave us a lot of freedom and a lot of joy and a lot of opportunities, not because we were rich, because we were not, but because we lived in a society in which these basic things that every human being needs were there, and we didn't go through horrible traumas. So I think that I would be very careful about this kind of things going 400 years ago or 200 years ago or something, or even 100 years ago, and saying, you have to pay us compensation because of what we went through. I don't think this is right. And I don't think this is, and I'm sure that if people will do the epigenetic studies, they will find this is probably nonsense. And I think we have to be very careful about these things, about epigenetics, because there is a lot of hype around it. On the one hand, people don't know anything about it or don't understand it, although it's not difficult to understand. On the other hand, people suddenly, it's a kind of magic word that you can, through which you can understand everything. So, you know, in Russia now they explain everything. Yes, we went through Leningrad, the starvation in Leningrad, and all this horror that went. Oh, that's why I'm drunk. That's why I'm an alcoholic. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, you know, you can't do it. And it's like giving genetic excuses to things. Epigenetic excuses are not a good thing. I'm not saying that sometimes you don't have epigenetic kind of inheritance of all kinds of problems. You may well have, and we have to be aware of it, but they are reversible. This is the important thing. And this is what we have to put into the heads of people, that it's not something that this is it. You know, once when I realized it very, very strongly many years ago, I gave a lecture. And suddenly somebody came to me and said, now I understand. My wife works with the Black people, and it's very, very difficult to teach them, and the poor Black people are in urban. And it's very, very difficult to teach them. Maybe it's epigenetic effects of, you know, I felt like I thought, so I gave him a whole lecture about this thing. At the time, we had very, very little about reversal. But from biological logic, it was clear that it will happen, although I wasn't sure. But at the time, now I'm much more sure. But, you know, this is a very big danger, also to stigmatize people through epigenetics, in the same way that we stigmatize people through genetics. We should be very, very careful about these things, because what this woman is trying to do with the reparations or whatever is dangerous. It's not only probably not true and misleading, probably, I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's also dangerous because she's stigmatizing people. Okay.
Oh, okay, thanks a lot, Eva.
Yeah, thank you.
I would also like to invite all the other attendees if you would like to ask Eva a question. I know we're running over time, but Eva, if you're still active,
I don't mind. I have time.
You can raise your hand and ask your question. Maybe you can also switch on your, if you want, video so we can see you. But if anyone of the attendees has a question.
I would be glad to see people. I don't like looking at the little circles.
Yes.
Hello. So it's Wim van den Bergen from
Hello.
University, also from the Epigenetics lab. So we also have been studying a bit stress in children from orphan cohorts. And yeah, last week we have been discussing with colleagues. So what could be the impact on the epigenetic impact of like anxiety of COVID lockdown and also mouth mask that limit human communication. So you have less empathy if somebody is covered in the face. So if people have to wear for many months mouth mask, especially children, what could be the long-term impact? Could be also kind of stress-induced response with long-lasting consequences.
Mm-hmm. So what do I think?
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, they did one study after the Twin Towers fell. You probably know it.
Yeah.
So they did this, and it was one big stress, and they looked at the children that were born to women who underwent this stress, and they found something. I don't know if it was a good study or not, but they did find something epigenetically different, and the kids were a bit hyperactive, and hyperactive and things like this. So this suggests, if it's true, and I'm not sure it's true, but if it's true, it means that even a relatively short stress can have quite long-term effects. And we know also that other stresses, not psychological ones, but the long winter, also had the transgeneration. Women who were pregnant during that time and who were stressed because of that. I don't know about the corona, and I don't know how it will impact people. It's a very good question. And it's as far as I'm concerned, it's totally open. I guess that most kids will bounce back to normal, most kids. But maybe there will be a group that without this corona thing would be much better off than with the corona thing. And maybe this group needs a lot of attention. And I don't know how to, also I don't know what age group you are talking about.
Oh, and also in society, you see like two quite opposite behaviors. Some people who are very, who follow very strict the rules, and they are very afraid. And then the other ones who are more rebel. So they say, no, we cannot deal with that. So we should fight. And so I was also thinking if these are two different ways of canalization of stress.
Yes, I think there are. I think that you can deal with problems by being very, very narrow, and you can deal with problems by exploring also. I mean, there are very different ways of coping. But what I'm trying to say, what age group are you working with?
Well, okay, they are following up. So they were following up children, at the age of 5 to 8, and now during puberty. So it was the Bucharest cohort, and we have been studying them like people who were adopted or who are received by family, and they have different stress levels and different behavior. And we're trying to find out also some differences.
And are you looking also at women who are pregnant women who give birth now after 6 months of corona? Are you looking at them?
No, there's not. So it's two independent studies. So one is like an adoption cohort that was followed up. But now with the whole COVID conditions, we were wondering, would this also have kind of impact on stress in children, and especially in puberty school kids?
It's a very good question. I think that it will. But it probably, since everything has epigenetic effects, this will have epigenetic effects. It probably, hopefully, will not be transmitted.
So we were just wondering what could be the best way to to optimize the resilience. So like how can we strengthen children to cope as much as possible with this stress exposure? So by nutrition or we do not know, but
I don't know either. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know how you do it, but from animals, all I know from is animals a little bit, and from animals, and also from my experience as a mother and so on, giving them a lot of opportunity to play, and of course, giving them good food and stuff like this goes without saying, but giving them a lot of opportunity to play and explore and talk about it and things like this. I mean, play is the ability to play and exercise is very important.
Yeah.
In rats.
Yeah. Like enriched environment.
But I think in humans too. So, but of course, since they have language and you can talk to them and you can play with language too.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but
Yeah, because now there's a lot of discussion in press. So how they have to deal with school kids who go back to school and they have to obey and to follow the rules, this and this, and there's so many rules.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's really very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We may see later on.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Probably. But I think we do our best, and I hope the teachers are. I guess a lot of teachers really care about the kids.
Yeah.
Well, they have a lot of experience, and probably without theorizing will do the right thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Anne-Sophie?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well.
No, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And my question now is relating the dynamic relationship also between stability and change. So you said, well, first we need to understand the dynamics of stability before we can explore what the dynamics of change look like. But then you also said, well, we only have stability if there's a lot of change already ongoing. So that is why we spoke about dynamics of stability. And as a process ontologist, I really love this idea. I think it's crucial to understand everything. I mean, that follows from it then also when we talk about agency and maybe free will. So now I'm wondering, assuming, okay, there are these dynamics of stability, they involve change. What can we say on that basis more specifically about the dynamics of change? And that also relates to some questions raised by Ho and Sander, I guess. So this ability, how is it possible that an individual at some point might be able to look over the hills and think, oh, well, there might be other possibilities. So, I mean, you addressed situations where, speaking of reversal of epigenetic heredity, okay, maybe we change the situation, we put people in better situations, and then the effects somehow vanish. But there are other situations where maybe people are not given these opportunities, so they have to find themselves ways of getting out of situations. And for philosophers, this is often a big puzzle, right? So now some people think, oh, everything's determined genetically, then there's social determinism and universal determinism anyway. So where's that space for free will? And so I'm really wondering how this theory that takes seriously this interplay between plasticity and canalization in the dynamic systems context or approach can help us with also these really big and perennial philosophical questions about free will. And maybe you have some first guess or ideas on where this comes from, that we as goal-setting beings require. Where do we take these resources from?
That's a big question. And
yeah, well,
yeah, and it's a big question, and I'll start with something more. So one of the things we can ask is, okay, where I want to start, because of my background as a geneticist, I want to start with the dynamics of stability before I start with the dynamics of change. But of course, things change. Now here we are, and we're sitting here, and many of us are women, right? This wouldn't have happened 200 years ago. And so what happened that allowed this? How did we emerge? How did we manage to sort of pull ourselves like Münchhausen, with our hair through from this nasty attractor in which we were buried for a long time? And it's a very difficult question. So it is the thing that, first of all, we're very, very variable people. And there is a lot of variability in every sense in society, among humans. And some people are more rebellious than others for all kinds of reasons. And they always explore the limits of things, sort of, because this is part of what we are able to do. And when you're looking at the history of the woman liberation movement from the 18th century to the 20th century, where women were given some rights, well, you can see that it was both dependent on individuals and on written stuff and on politics and on many factors. And if we want to understand what happened there, we really have to go through all this into all these aspects of this particular history to understand it, and into the psychology, that the social psychology and the individual psychology that was part of it. You know, that's why when I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the social landscape, and I'm talking about the socialization that people undergo and how they are socialized into society and what society they're socialized into, it is we're talking about individuals and groups of individuals going through a process of socialization, but it doesn't always lead to the same attractor. Usually it does, not always. And these people who are managing to either extend their attractor or make it more shallow or move into another one, they are some of the agents of change. But they are not the only ones. I mean, it can happen only in some conditions. You cannot be very, very poor and do it. You just can't. You have to have, for example, education. When you're looking at the women who did it, most of them, not all of them, but in the beginning, most of them came from some certain educated strata of society, right? When you are looking at the people who were the great and the good, right? Those that we remember, the great scientists, the great writers, the great whatevers, most of them, until quite recently, didn't come from the working class, okay, and didn't come among the women. And there were no women among them. How many great women scientists can you, in the 19th century, can you think about? Not many. And so, you know, so this is something that we have to think about, and we also have to think about the role of conflict in cultural evolution among groups, and about institutional changes, new kinds of interactions, new kinds of modes of transmission, all kinds of things like this. You know, if I'm thinking about my own heritage. I mean, there was something called the Jewish Enlightenment, which happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was a movement that was advocating integration within general non-Jewish culture. And it was the result of political and social changes in the non-Jewish society, but not only in the non-Jewish society, right? It also there was more tolerance and ability to accept the Jews into the general society during this period, in the post-Enlightenment in Europe. So this created a kind of not joining, but an ability to move between two attractors, if you want, between two landscapes. Mm-hmm. And create a new hybrid landscape for some of them, but of course it was only some of them. And you have to think, so you can think about communication technologies that can change things. And for example, if we're talking about the corona, one of the things that the corona is doing is it is changing practices. Mm. Yes, it is changing working practices, education practices, hygiene practices. I don't know if it will have long-term effect. We'll see, but it might. Maybe it will form some kind of loop, and this loop will be self-sustaining, and maybe it won't. I don't know, but when I'm looking at historical changes such as the Jewish Enlightenment or the movement for the liberation of women, or the giving rights to homosexuals, I see how this new landscape, how this new attractor is being formed. But I can do it not in general. I can do it in the specific case. I have to look at all the factors that are important in it and how they come together and how they join together and how they reinforce each other and so on and so on and so forth, and take into account a lot of factors. Free will is a very, very difficult question, of course. But the point is that one of the things that a friend of mine, a linguist, wrote wrote and said about language was that language is a technology, a social technology for the instruction of imagination. Now, I think that we can imagine ourselves in that we're very strange creatures. On the one hand, we can imagine ourselves in many, many different situations, doing many, many different things, and so on and so forth. But there's a huge amount of possibility, sort of theoretical possibility, of course, that we have. And then, on the other hand, we have the kind of social superego, the ought, what we ought to do. And the kind of thing that we ought to do, the ought, and the interactions between the ought and the space of the huge space of possibilities, this is what gives us the ability for free will. Without the ought, we will not have free will. We will just have a lot of possibilities. Very good, but this is not free will. The ought tells us what we should, and once we have the should, then we have the free will to do or not to do it. So for me, what free will is not something that is. It's like, you know, it's like love. It's not something that is out there in the world. It is the outcome of certain interaction. In this case, it is the interaction between our linguistically driven imagination and the social ought. Although I'm saying linguistically driven, but I do think that the old directors people had something of it. So they did have a social ought, I think. Mm. And they did have quite a lot of imagination, although they much less than us because they couldn't communicate about it. Mm-hmm. And that's a big thing. So I think that we have this kind of thing, and our ability to imagine things is one of the to imagine things, and with language helping us to imagine them so enormously, is something that gives us this space of really a space of possibility, and also the space to reject the norms of society, or you know, sometimes and sometimes for good reasons.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful. I agree with most of it, and I mean I'm working on this, and I'm looking forward to further exchange maybe in the future. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else has a question? Okay, then I would like to thank everyone for your presence, and Eva and the respondents for their interesting presentation. We're going to, the meeting is recorded, and I'm going to put it on our YouTube channel, so I'm sure that I will re-watch it a couple of times to better understand everything, because there was so much in this lecture that I thought it was really amazing. So thank you all, and see you maybe next time.
And thank you very much for inviting me. It was a lot of fun. I haven't had a lecture like this for a long time. So
yes,
I
thank you.
Really, really nervous, I must tell you.
Yes, but it was excellent. I really enjoyed it. It was really.
I was very nervous before. I said, I'm out of practice. I'm out of practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
You can all switch on your microphones and let's go.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm going to stop recording.